Now we're going to cover our chapter on the federal system, or sometimes known as federalism. Um, this is one of those concepts that, if you are not from the United States, may be kind of foreign to you. And even if you are from the United States, some people have trouble understanding what federalism is. Federalism is just the way the different levels of our government share their power, and the Constitution sets out some guidelines on what area the federal government will have control over and what area the states and local government will have control. So that's all it is. We have this unique system created by the Constitution. So, um, under the federal system or federalism, it's just how the national government and state government share power. The word federalism never appears in the Constitution, but it is the system that they create when they write the Constitution. If you remember, our first attempt at government was a confederation. And under the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, we had a weak central government, a government that didn't have the power to tax citizens. It didn't have the power to maintain an army because it had no revenue. It was very weak. And so the founders realized this, and this is why the Constitution is written, to strengthen the central government, to be able to have some authority to maintain security and other things like that. And then, of course, the system we had before that was the unitary system because we were a colony under the power of the King of England. And in a unitary system, the national government has all of the power because the government runs at the will of the monarch, and so the central government has all the power in a unitary system. What we create is a system of government that doesn't really exist anywhere in the world when we create it. Um, and so the Constitution, which we touched on this in that chapter, creates some different levels of authority. So, first, we have the express powers. And in Article 1 and in Article 2, the Constitution lays out specific powers that belong to Congress in Article 1, Section 8, and powers that belong to the President in Article 2. And then it creates this kind of gray area of implied powers. And this comes from the necessary and proper clause. And the necessary and proper clause essentially says that Congress can assume extra powers to enforce the express powers given to it by the Constitution. Now, Congress still has to, uh, you know, powers that they create for themselves have to be in line with the Constitution. They just can't take over and become all powerful. But a good example of this. So, one of the responsibilities of federal government is to collect tax revenue from the citizens. Now, Congress does not do this itself. What it did is it created an agency. It created the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, probably the most hated government agency in our system. But the IRS collects tax revenue on behalf of the federal government. Now, the IRS is not mentioned in the Constitution, but Congress doesn't have the time, along with all of its other responsibilities, to be in charge of collecting tax revenue. So they use the necessary and proper clause to create an agency that handles that responsibility for them. So that's a good example of things that can be done through the necessary and proper clause. That you can create additional powers or an agency to help you carry out the responsibilities given to you by the Constitution. All right. Now, reserved powers. This comes in the form of the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment states that powers not specifically given to the federal government belong to the states and to the people. One of the biggest ones of these that we are dealing with right now is what we call police power. Police power is reserved for the states because it is not addressed in the Constitution. Police power allows the state to regulate things like health, safety, morality, criminal justice, all of those responsibilities. Now, we're seeing a very good example of conflict with police power right now. So, since the pandemic started with COVID-19, we've had this push and pull between the federal government and the state governments, and the people. So we have different orders in different states where, like now in Texas, we have an order from our governor that we have to wear face mask anytime we go into a business or something like that. Um, the president, Donald Trump, he for some reason is against this and is trying to tell the states what to do when it comes to the mandates they're putting in place for COVID 19. He's really pushing this idea that everyone should be back in school in person come September. Um, there's been a lot of conflict between the federal government and the state governments over this issue. Well, the Constitution is pretty clear that the responsibility for these issues belongs to the state. But there is one little catch there is any area where the states get money from the federal government can choose to withhold that money. And we'll talk about that in a second. But for the most part, these things, health, safety, morality, criminal justice, those are under the authority of each state. And that is why we have different regulations about, criminal justice punishment, the death penalty from state to state. Concurrent power are powers that overlap. Both the federal government and the state government have these powers. Things like taxation. You will, unfortunately, for the rest of your life, pay taxes to multiple levels of government. You pay your income tax to the federal government. We pay sales tax and property taxes to the state here in Texas. Some states have their own state income tax. We do not. And then you pay local taxes to local government for property, for also additional sales tax and other fees and taxes that are, added to say like your water bill and stuff like that. So this is one power where all levels of government tax citizens. Full faith and credit clause. This one is very important, and this is something that we've seen some conflict over as well. Article 4, Section 1 it says that states must honor public acts and judicial decisions from other states and the federal government. So let's say that you live in Texas, but you get a criminal judgment against you in California. The states are obligated to and enforce those criminal orders. So, if say you're convicted of a crime in California, but you're in Texas, Texas is obligated to arrest you and extradite you to the state of California. Or if you have a business contract and you've been sued, Texas is obligated to enforce the outcome of that judicial decision. So that's what we mean by full faith and credit. They have to recognize those judicial decisions and enforce them and go along with them. Now, at the federal level, this really pertains a lot to Supreme Court decisions. And I use two examples here. This picture here on the left is the Loving couple. You may have heard of them, or there was a movie made about them. But they were a couple who got married while there were still laws. Excuse me. Excuse me. Sorry. They got married when there were still laws against interracial marriage. And so they were arrested, they were put in jail, they were mistreated, beaten, people would threaten them, all that kind of stuff. And so the ACLU comes to them and decides that they're going to take on their case. And the ACLU fights their case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that the state and federal government do not have a compelling interest to tell two adults of any race that they cannot be married. And so this decision overturns those interracial marriage laws in all 50 states because the states have to give full faith and credit to Supreme Court rulings. And then the next case, Obergefell versus Hodges, which a lot of people don't know the name of the case, but in 2015, gay marriage was legalized in the United States. And many of the arguments used in the Loving case were also used in the Obergefell case. And so when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of gay marriage in 2015, all 50 states had to then comply. So their state laws against it no longer matter because the Supreme Court has made that decision. And then, if you remember, we saw problems all over the country with counties who weren't recognizing or giving gay couples marriage licenses and things like that. But eventually, all states, all counties eventually complied with the decision. Now, people are still fighting this decision and would like to see it overturned, but I don't think that's going to happen. But you have to go along with the law, regardless of whether you like it or not, once a decision is made at the Supreme Court level. Privileges and Immunities Clause, Article 4, Section 2. States cannot discriminate against people from other states or give their citizens special privileges. We don't see this as much today, but back when the country was still expanding and there were states and there were territories and things like that, you would see different laws from state to state where they would recognize citizens of the state, but people who were not permanent citizens of the state could be denied different privileges and things like that. That is not constitutional. One thing the Constitution does not like is for the laws to be different from state to state. Loving versus Virginia and Obergefell versus Hodges are good examples of that. The Constitution implies that we have the same rights and privileges as citizens of the United States, no matter where we are in the country. So to give people different privileges in different states really is against the Constitution. With gay marriage, when the Obergefell decision was made, we were at almost a half and half at the state level, where almost half of the states had legalized gay marriage, and a little over half still had gay marriage as illegal. And the Constitution doesn't like this. The Constitution says that, the Bill of Rights, the civil liberties, all of that applies to every citizen, no matter where you are in the country. So if we have a situation like that, it has to be resolved. And then home rule, you'll talk more about this when you take state government, Texas government, but it's the power given to local government from the state. So local government, city and county, has no real authority on its own. It is granted by the state that it is in. So the state recognizes those powers and can choose to ignore those powers. And we've seen some of that as well right now over in Dallas County. The county judge, who is kind of the chief administrator of the county, has been ordering businesses to close, has been ordering masks well before the state did. And so there was this conflict over whether local government could do that or not. And really, local government it derives its authority from the state. So if the state says you can't do this, then local government kind of has to go along with that. All right. Now, there's a couple of different types of federalism, the way we've practiced federalism throughout our history. The first is called dual federalism, and we kind of use the analogy of a layer cake to illustrate it. So if you look over here on the right, you can see these 3 layers of this cake, and they are separated by delicious icing and filling between each layer. And that's how dual federalism works. And this was the system we had from 1789 to 1937. Each level of government had this layer of separation from the others. And so each level of government stuck to the powers it was given and didn't interfere with other levels of government. So during this time period, federal government had the responsibility to enforce tariffs on imports and exports, deal with public land issues, register patents, maintain the currency. These are all the responsibilities that federal government is given by the Constitution. State responsibility came in the form of registering property ownership through deeds, commerce, banking, business, family, morality, public health, criminal justice, land use, etc. So, under this system, the state actually had a lot more authority because they were in charge of regulating far more of the day to day issues for citizens than the federal government. If you remember when we were talking about the Constitution, there was this argument over how much power to give the federal government. And so these are the things that they decided were necessary for federal government to enforce. And that's pretty much what federal government stuck to from the founding, the writing of the Constitution, until we get to the 1930s. Um, the Commerce Clause is really important during this time period. Article 1, Section 8 delegates Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. That's the actual text from the Constitution. So if commerce or business had to do with foreign countries, if it crossed state lines and became interstate commerce, or if it was with the Native American tribes, this was under the authority of federal government. It was their job to regulate that business. But business that just stayed within state borders was the responsibility of that state. So, an example, if you lived here in Texas and you started, say, an insurance company, and you were only selling health insurance to Texans here in the state, you would be under the authority of the state of Texas to regulate your business. And Texas is a very, very business friendly state, low regulations. That's why a lot of companies come here. But the moment you start selling your insurance to people in states outside of Texas or worldwide, then you are now under the authority of federal government. And so they can impose additional regulations on your business. Most people don't like this because the federal government has stricter regulations, is going to tax your business, all that kind of stuff. Whereas you have states like Texas that are more laid back when it comes to business. Um, so the Supreme Court, though, has ruled that the federal government has power over the economy because the economy is a nationwide thing. And so if the federal government has to step in to stabilize the economy, that has been upheld by the Supreme Court. So if the federal government decides, like they did at the beginning of the pandemic, that all citizens need a stimulus check or something like that, they have the power to do that because it is part of keeping the economy stable. Those next two Supreme Court cases, don't worry about those. We're not going to talk about those right now. States' rights is a big thing that you hear in this conflict with federal government. The idea that the states should oppose increasing federal government authority. And that's pretty much the state of how things were under dual federalism. The states were very resistant to federal government taking any of their authority away. Now, 1937 is when this system starts to change. Um, so, what happens in 1937 or leading up to 1937? Um, a lot of things are happening here in the country. We are in the midst of the Great Depression. Prior to the Great Depression, um, government took responsibility for the poor through charity. So, really, it was up to churches and other charity organizations to help people who were unemployed, who were living in poverty, who had no food. It was, and this is the reason why churches enjoy tax exempt status because for a big chunk of our history, they were in charge of private charity. The government had no kind of safety net system for citizens. But the Great Depression happens, and 25% of Americans who were working are now unemployed. The stock market crashes. People lose all their savings and everything, their homes and stuff like that. People are homeless, living in camps, and kind of traveling the country from coast to coast trying to find work. And President Hoover, who precedes Franklin Delano Roosevelt, said that federal government didn't have the authority to step in and do much about the Depression because most of this was the responsibility of the states. So Franklin Roosevelt runs on the idea of the New Deal. He sells this idea to American citizens through his campaign. He does these what are called fireside chats on the radio. One of the first presidents to really embrace media in that way. But he talks to the American people about his plan. He wants to create public programs such as welfare, Social Security, a public works program to put people back to work, working on the infrastructure of the country, and he wins. He wins the election and becomes one of the most popular presidents in American history. But this will have a lot of effects on federalism. But just kind of looking at a timeline of the Great Depression, in the 1920s, banks start to fail. Now, today, when we put our money in a bank, our money is insured by you usually see that little sticker at the bank that says FDIC. That is an agency that insures your money. So no matter what happens, you can go to the bank and get your money out. This was not the case in the 1920s. If the bank failed, you may lose all of your money because your money doesn't stay at the bank. The bank uses your money to make investments, loan it to other people, things like that. In 1921, agriculture prices fall drastically, so farmers start suffering because they can't sell their goods at a high enough price to really support themselves. In 1926, industry starts to decline, especially construction, manufacturing, and things like that. In 1929, inventories of consumer goods and cars were at an all-time high. So people were going broke and did not have the money to buy consumer goods. And so people were suffering, businesses are suffering, entire industries are suffering. And because the way our country works is our country does well when people have money to spend. And so that kind of puts us in this very precarious position. And then, of course, in October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashes and takes the economy with it. People start to panic. Everyone's pulling their money out of banks, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And that's kind of the final straw that puts us into the Great Depression. Now, I'm going to skip ahead one. The New Deal brings with it a new type of federalism, which we call cooperative federalism or marble cake federalism. Yeah, the cakes are good analogies. If you look at this cake, marble cake, you can see that the chocolate and the vanilla are all mixed up and there's no way to really separate them. And that's what the New Deal does to federalism. And this is the system that we still have today. In the New Deal, FDR comes up with this idea of using grants and aid to help the states get out of the Great Depression. But he also uses these grants to enforce federal ideas of what the states should be doing. So if you wanted to get grant money, you had to agree to all of the strings that were attached to it. So I'm going to go back one slide real quick. So there's a couple of different types of grants. And this is how the federal government expands its power. You don't have to take the money, but if you do take the money, you have to agree to any strings that are attached to it. So a few different types of grants that were used. Categorical grants, these could be used for a specific purpose and are still widely used today. So if the federal government gives you education grants, that money can only be used for educational purposes. It cannot be allocated to business or welfare or whatever. It's classified solely for education. But if you take that money, then any of the requirements for education, like let's say testing or meeting a certain level of performance or things like that, those are attached to that money. So the moment that you take it, you then have to comply with those requirements. Project grants are grants for usually for like infrastructure, like say you want to build a bridge or you need new highways or things like that. You can submit an idea for a project. Maybe you come up with some of the money and you want the federal government to pay for the rest. But again, these will come with conditions that you have to adhere to. Formula grants, we don't use those as much anymore, but it's a complicated formula or algorithm to determine how much states should be entitled to. But yeah, this changes federalism because now the states are obligated by taking these grants to comply with the federal government. And so we tend to refer to this as regulated federalism as well, because now Congress can use legislation to ensure that the states comply with what they want them to do through giving them this money. An example, the Americans with Disabilities Act, environmental standards like emissions and pollution and things like that, standards for education, all of these are enforced on the states because the states take grant money. Sometimes the states will require something and not give the states the money to make the changes, and we call those unfunded mandates. Something like saying every building needs a wheelchair ramp. When the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, that was the case, but they didn't give the states any money to comply. So the states essentially had to pay for that out of their pocket. Preemption is just the idea that the national government can override state and local law, and this is the process by which they do that. Grants are a big part of that. Now, as you can imagine, this type of federalism is not very popular with conservatives. Conservatives want small government and government involved in state affairs as little as possible. So once we get to the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, we see a pushback. And it starts with Richard Nixon, but really carries into the Reagan era. In 1970, we see this process called devolution, where Nixon starts this process of trying to take some power away from the federal government and give it back to states. And he does this through what are called block grants. So instead of deciding what the states can do with the money for specific projects or specific categories, Nixon comes up with this idea to just give the states lump sums of money called block grants and let the states decide what they want to do with it. This is not very successful. Most of you, all of you, probably were not alive in the 1970s or 80s. I was not alive in the 1970s. But if you go back and look at this period of time, if you look at especially big cities, I'm a big fan of hip hop. So I've watched a lot of documentaries about hip hop in New York and that period of time. But if you look at, how cities and states are doing during this time period, there is housing shortages, there is massive pollution, living conditions start to deteriorate. If you look at documentaries of New York from this time period, there are entire neighborhoods where there are just piles of rubble because people tear down apartment buildings and then don't do anything with them, and the rubble just sits there in the neighborhoods, mostly in poor neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color, things like that. And a lot of this is because the federal government no longer is requiring these conditions to be met, and many of them are things like environmental standards, housing standards, things like that. So the block grants give the states more power to decide what they want to do with the money without all these strings attached to it. The problem is they don't really use it to help the people. They use it to enrich the state. So you really can see evidence of this causing suffering, especially in poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. This process is called New Federalism, and it was It's preferred by Republicans, conservatives, who want to give power back to the states. A big tenet of republicanism is states' rights and small government. So they believe that states can make better decisions for their citizens because they know what's going on in the state. The flip side of that is some states will do that. But the flip side of that is when you don't require the states to do certain things, sometimes they ignore it altogether, and that's detrimental to the citizens. Um, One thing that the states will do with these block grants is what we call general revenue sharing, where grant money, tax money that is created for one part of government will be allocated to another part of government instead of being reinvested where it should go. So let's say property taxes. During this period, property taxes should be reinvested in housing, should be reinvested in keeping the city and the state nice, things like that. But instead, they may be diverted to economic issues, business issues, and things like that, because that's generating more revenue for the state. They're making money, but they're not reinvesting it in citizens. And that's kind of what we saw through the 1980s. Now, one of the big areas that is enforced through federalism is redistributive programs. These are the programs that we refer to as welfare. So most of the welfare system it's a responsibility shared by the federal government and state government. Um, and essentially, we use tax money and spending to benefit those living in poverty in our country. Now, conservatives tend not to like welfare programs. They would like to scale them back. There are conservatives like Ted Cruz, which, if you know me, Ted Cruz is one of my most hated politicians. I would like to fight him in the octagon. Um, but Ted Cruz would like to cut welfare altogether, just get rid of it. That's not really probably healthy for our country. Now, it's not to say that the welfare system doesn't need reform. It most definitely does. Um, but the two parties kind of differ on welfare. But through cooperative federalism, we have required that the states allocate certain amounts of money to welfare to help those living in poverty. Um, so at times when we've seen more responsibility for welfare given to the states, like in 1996, the states will cut programs, set strict time limits, make people on welfare work in low wage jobs that require as a requirement for the assistance, but then the money they may make them ineligible to receive assistance, even though they're not making enough money to get by. And the whole purpose of this was to get people off of welfare, even though those people were still living in poverty and probably needed help. So we kind of see a shift back and forth depending on who's in control. Um, Democrats rather believe that we should expand welfare for the benefit of citizens, that, things like school food programs, food stamps, housing vouchers, things like that, that if we want people to be successful, they need to have these most basic needs taken care of. So but that's not to say that there's not abuse in the system. We all know that there is abuse in the welfare system. It's just not as high as people tend to think it is. So most statistics show, as of 2015, I need to find a more up to date statistic here, but 100 million people, or 1/3 of our population, lives in poverty or very near poverty. So we have a lot of people in our country that need welfare services, but one of the biggest arguments that you'll hear from conservative states is that, oh, there's so much welfare fraud and people take advantage of the system, and if we give people welfare, they're not going to want to work, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's not to say that that's not true. There are people in the system like that. The problem is that welfare fraud is not as high as people think it is. In the state of Texas, welfare fraud only occurs at about 3%. So only 3% of the people on welfare are defrauding the system. That's still a lot of people, but that's used as justification to get rid of the system altogether. And what 3% of the people are doing, to me, doesn't justify taking it away from the 97%. So, but yeah, depending on what your political ideology is, you'll have different, feelings about this particular issue. Now, looking at federalism since the year 2000, we've seen increased polarization between our two parties, which leads to gridlock and things not getting done. Some of the major issues for federalism in the 21st century have been things like social program spending, so everything from welfare to education to healthcare, especially. We're still having a big debate over healthcare. Climate change. We can't seem to get our shit together enough to agree to do something about climate change. Some of you may not believe in it. I believe in it. I believe the science. That's my opinion. You don't have to agree with my opinion. But it is a major issue facing us as a country, and one that we have pretty much chosen to ignore for the most part. Regulation of business. We're starting to hear this more and more, especially when we're talking about the wealth gap in our country, where we have the top 1% who are making money at outrageous rates, and the rest of the country is not growing in the same way. And those individuals are getting out of paying their tax responsibility to the country. So that's been a big issue for the past couple of decades, because we have these tech billionaires now who are getting richer and richer. We have someone like Bezos, who is on track to become the first trillionaire in history. But Amazon typically pays zero in taxes, so they're not giving anything back to the country that is enabling them to become so wealthy. Morality, where we still, abortion is probably one of the most dividing issues in our country. Gay marriage, trans issues, all of this falls in this category because the people that oppose it tend to use moral and religious arguments against it. And then, of course, immigration. Immigration is an issue that has, kind of, it's been with us for our entire history. We are a country of immigrants. And so now we're getting to the point where we want to keep other people out. And so, yeah, this is a tough one. And this is going to be a major factor in this upcoming election. We have a president in President Trump that has taken a very hard line on immigration. We have DACA, we have the child detention issue at the border. And this is going to weigh heavily on how Latinos choose to vote in the next election. And so immigration has become a big issue for our country because it is a core issue that Latinos vote on, and Latinos are becoming, we are the second largest ethnic group in the country. And in some states like Texas, we are rapidly approaching becoming the at least equal to the white population, or possibly have a higher number of population than the white population. So immigration is a factor that can make or break elections. We've seen conflict. We're seeing more conflict between the federal government and the state government. Texas is always one of the states that will oppose the federal government. We've seen it, a lot in the past couple of decades, but the pandemic has really kind of brought it out in a way we haven't seen before. There's a lot of distrust of government, a lot of people, how dare you tell me what to do? I'm not wearing a mask, et cetera, America, dun, 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 dun. But we are seeing how federalism plays out in the real world right now quite a lot. Now, issues that are currently challenging federalism. One, marijuana legalization. If you remember what I said when we were talking about gay marriage, with gay marriage, we had a situation where it was legal in almost half the states and it was illegal in the other half. Well, we're right there with marijuana. We are rapidly approaching a situation where we have marijuana legal in half our states and marijuana not legal in the other half. Is this an issue of federalism? Well, yes, there's a very good argument to be made here that it is. One, Many people use marijuana as a medicine for pain, for hunger, for treating cancer, for a lot of different things. And so you can make the argument that you are being denied the right to use this medicine depending on what state you live in. Also, in some states where they have legalized marijuana, they are doing away with prison sentences. They're letting people out of prison, clearing their record, all that kind of stuff. So if you're in jail for marijuana in Texas, you could make the argument that you're being denied something that is being given to citizens of other states. And again, the Constitution doesn't like this. So I won't be surprised if in the next, depending on who's elected in the next election, that marijuana is an issue that is resolved. Abortion rights is still an argument that we're having. Roe versus Wade legalized abortion in 1972. But we're still seeing states try and restrict abortion through different laws. The issue is settled, but that keeps going back to the Supreme Court based on the way they write these laws. Is it permissible? Because the original decision said that the states could put reasonable restrictions on abortion. They just couldn't outlaw abortion. So the states, many states like Texas and southern states that are conservative, keep trying to restrict access to abortion. Internet rights. This is a big one for us. Like we've pretty much lived our whole lives with the internet, and now we're seeing issues like net neutrality, monitoring our presence on the internet, all that kind of stuff become a bigger and bigger issue. And so, where does the federal government step in? Where does the state government step in? Do they have the right to step in? We're seeing lots of conflict with Facebook and Twitter and whether they should be allowed to allow things to be posted that are not true, which then gives voters false information. This is a big issue right now. And then, of course, immigration we talked about. And just a little funny meme to end this chapter on.